She just stepped out of the airplane cage at a busy international airport. Amidst the hustle and bustle of people, she was just a woman hoping to find some peace. But that peace was shattered. Two policemen stopped her. No clear explanation, just judgmental eyes. Why her? Was it because her clothes were a little more modest than they would have allowed for someone like her? Or was it simply because of the color of her skin? The suggestive, insulting questions started, and when she dared to stand up for respect and reason, things spiraled out of control. In front of hundreds of curious eyes, her hands were twisted behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She, a calm woman, was now being treated like a dangerous criminal in broad daylight. Humiliation and anger welled up. But then, in the midst of the injustice, a sudden change occurred. She requested a phone call. Just one call. And the words she uttered into that phone were not pleas or cries for help. They were titles, secret orders that left the two arrogant policemen speechless. Their faces changed from smug to horrified. Who did they mess with? Who exactly is this seemingly ordinary woman whose one phone call brought the Pentagon to action? What awaits these two abusers? The answer will shock you. Let's listen to this unbelievable story. The familiar whir of jet engines faded as the Boeing 777 touched down gently on the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Inside the business class cabin, Evelyn shifted in her spacious seat, trying to shake off the fatigue that had stiffened after nearly 10 hours in the air from Frankfurt. The cabin lights brightened, signaling the end of the flight. But for Evelyn, it was just the beginning of another journey. A journey home, to the peace she had longed for after 3 stressful weeks at an international security conference. At 51, Evelyn had the air of a quiet grace and dignity honed by decades of military service. Her hair was black, streaked with silver, the silent badges of time and experience. Her coffee milk skin was smooth, though there were a few lines around her deep, dark brown eyes. Today, she wore a simple yet refined civilian outfit, fitted beige slacks, a navy silk blouse, and a black cashmere blazer. No insignia, no uniform, only her erect posture and steady gaze betrayed her true self. She stretched, feeling her joints crack. This trip had been exhausting. Long meetings, complex strategy discussions, representing the U.S. Army to international allies. It had all required her full attention. Right now, all she wanted was a cup of hot tea, her familiar living room chair, and maybe a long video call with her daughter, who was in college in California. A rare smile crossed her lips as she thought of Sarah. "Business class passengers, please prepare to disembark via L1. The flight attendant's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. Evelyn stood up, grabbed her leather bag and coat, and joined the slow-moving stream of people heading toward the door. She felt the familiar hustle and bustle of JFK as soon as she stepped into the telescopic tube that connected to the terminal. English, Spanish, Chinese, French. All the languages mingled together, creating a noisy symphony of global movement. The smell of coffee mixed with perfume and the airport's signature recycled air filled her nostrils. People poured into the waiting area, and Evelyn, like many other passengers, began to make her way to the baggage claim area. She dragged her compact carry-on suitcase, her eyes scanning the signs. The fluorescent lights reflected on the polished marble floor, reflecting countless tired but eager faces. Children cried, adults laughed, the wheels of suitcases clattered across the floor. It was a completely normal scene at one of the busiest airports in the world. Evelyn just wanted to quickly get through this crowd, find her checked suitcase, and call a car back to her apartment in Brooklyn. But then an unusual presence interrupted her thoughts. Two figures in Port Authority uniforms stood not far away, near the entrance to the baggage carousel. The older man, John Miller, was a stocky man with a red face and small, squinting, searching eyes. His graying hair was cropped short, and his beer belly bulged beneath his flak jacket. He crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze scanning the crowd with a permanent scowl, as if every passenger were a potential nuisance. Next to him stood Kevin Baxter, younger, thinner, more junior, but trying to appear tough by mimicking his colleague's posture. Baxter's blue eyes darted around, uncertain but clearly seeking Miller's approval. Miller's gaze stopped abruptly, locking on Evelyn Hayes. She felt the look, a scrutinizing, assessing look that lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't the usual wary look of a security guard. There was something else, something heavy with prejudice. She saw him nudge Baxter, and then they both started toward her. Evelyn's heart sank. She'd seen looks like this before, though less frequently in recent years as her position had changed. But the familiar feeling of unease remained. A black woman, neatly dressed, just stepping out of business class. That seemed to be enough to trigger the officer's bias filter. They blocked her way, Miller standing directly in front of her, Baxter slightly to the right, forming a discreet but effective block. People hurried past them, a few looking back curiously. "Excuse me, ma'am," Miller said, his voice flat but laced with condescension. "Can we see some ID?" Evelyn paused, keeping her voice calm despite the rising sense of unease. "Is there a problem, officers?" She looked Miller straight in the eye, unflinching. Miller smirked, a smile almost imperceptible but full of irony. "Routine check. Just need to see your ID," he repeated, his gaze sweeping Evelyn from head to toe, stopping deliberately at her leather handbag and expensive outfit. That look said it all. "How does someone like you afford these things?" Evelyn suppressed a sigh. Routine inspection, in the middle of a crowded arrivals hall, targeting a passenger who had just stepped off the plane without any signs of suspicion. She knew this was not routine, but picking a fight was not the way to go. She opened her bag, took out her wallet, and handed Miller her New York driver's license. Miller took the license, examining it with unnecessarily slow eyes. He flipped it over, squinting at the words, then looked back up at Evelyn, comparing the photo to the real thing. The silence stretched tensely. Baxter stood beside him, his hand on the hilt of his baton, ready to spring into action. "Evelyn Hayes," Miller said, his voice deliberately drawn out. "Brooklyn Heights? That's expensive." His tone was suggestive. "What do you do for a living flying business class?" Evelyn's patience was beginning to wear thin. This question was completely beyond the scope of a routine ID check. "Officer," she said, her voice starting to harden, "my job has nothing to do with this ID check. Is there any particular reason you're stopping me? Do I match the description of a suspect?" Miller sneered, more clearly this time. "Oh, we were just curious, Mrs. Hayes. Seeing you all dressed up coming out of first class, it's not every day you see someone like you with such means." The "like you" was emphasized maliciously. Baxter, encouraged by Miller's wink, chimed in, "That's right. You'd better cooperate. Just answer a few questions." Evelyn's blood began to rush to her face. This humiliation, this naked racism, happening in the middle of an international airport, in front of so many people. She had spent her life serving this country, overcoming barriers both visible and invisible, proving that her abilities were not based on the color of her skin. And now, because of the color of her skin and the clothes she wore, she was being treated like a suspect. "You are overstepping your authority," Evelyn said, her voice firm but still trying to keep her voice moderate. "I have done nothing wrong. I demand to know the reason for my detention, or I would like to speak to your superiors." The request to speak to a superior seemed to be the last straw for Miller. For someone as overbearing as him, it was a sign of defiance. His face darkened. "Oh, and now you want to speak to a superior? Who do you think you are?" he roared, his voice now echoing through the concourse, drawing everyone's attention. Passengers began to stop, forming a curious circle around them. Several phones were raised. "You are not cooperating," Miller shouted. "This is obstruction of justice." "I am only asking for my rights," Evelyn replied, not backing down. Her eyes locked on Miller's, challenging his absurdity. "That's enough," Miller shouted, as if delivering a final judgment. "Obstruction of public duty. Handcuff her." Baxter hesitated for a moment, looking at the gathering crowd, but Miller's glare made him spring into action. Evelyn had no time to react as her arm was violently twisted behind her. A sharp pain shot from her shoulder to her wrist. She struggled to keep her balance, but the strength of two strong men was too much. "What are you doing? I didn't do anything!" Evelyn cried out, her voice betraying for the first time the anger and disbelief in it. Clack! The cold metal of the handcuffs rang dry as they tightened around her wrists. Humiliation and helplessness washed over Evelyn. She was now handcuffed like a criminal in her home airport, simply because of the color of her skin. She felt dozens of eyes on her, curious, pitying, fearful, and perhaps even gloating from a few. Her face burned with shame, but she held her head high, not letting them see her fall. A heavy silence fell over the area, broken only by Miller's gasps and the growing murmurs of the crowd. Miller looked at Evelyn, handcuffed, his face full of smugness. He moved closer, leaned close to her ear, his voice low but full of venom. "Let's see who has the power here. Think you're so good? Just a ... He left the sentence unfinished, but the contemptuous look said it all. Baxter stood beside her, avoiding Evelyn's eyes, looking a little uncomfortable but not daring to object. For Evelyn, this was more than an injustice. It was the ultimate affront to her dignity, to all she had worked for and achieved. Cold anger began to replace the shame. She would not let it end like this. Handcuffed behind her back, surrounded by unfamiliar eyes, Evelyn Hayes took a deep breath, trying to calm the wave of emotions surging through her chest. The humiliation still burned, but the iron discipline she had learned in the military had helped her regain some control. Now was not the time to break down or show weakness. Now was the time to act. She looked straight at the two policemen, her cold eyes unwavering. "Officers," her voice rang out, eerily calm, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "I need to make a phone call. Now." Miller laughed, a sneer of contempt and derision. "Oh, really? Who should I call? A lawyer? Mom?" He folded his arms, amused by Evelyn's predicament. Baxter laughed too, a strained laugh, but his eyes held a vague concern at the woman's unusual composure. "Get my phone from my purse," Evelyn repeated, her voice unchanged, but a quiet authority began to creep into each word. "It's a matter of national security." The word national security cut Miller's laughter short. He looked at Evelyn suspiciously. "National security? What are you playing at?" Still, the word had enough weight to make Baxter pause. He glanced at Miller, then back at Evelyn, hesitation written all over his face. The surrounding crowd murmured louder. National security? What was really going on? "I'm not playing any tricks," Evelyn said, her voice even. "Get your phone out, or you'll have to explain to higher authorities why you're interrupting a national security call." The determination in her voice and eyes made Miller uneasy. He wasn't sure if the woman was telling the truth or just trying to scare him, but something told him that this warning was not to be ignored. After a moment's hesitation, Miller jerked his chin toward Baxter. "Show her the phone. Let's see what she's up to." Baxter approached, somewhat hesitantly, and opened Evelyn's handbag that was hanging from her shoulder. He pulled out a fairly ordinary-looking new iPhone. "Who are you calling?" Baxter asked, holding the phone out to Evelyn. "No need," Evelyn said. "You dial it for me, because I'm handcuffed." She read a long string of numbers, not a regular phone number, but more like an access code or special line. Baxter frowned but followed, dialing each number carefully. He held the phone to Evelyn's ear, putting it on speakerphone as she requested. The waiting bell rang only once before a voice answered, a deep, professional male voice, devoid of emotion. Pentagon Secure Line Delta. Identify yourself. The moment the voice came through the speaker, the air around them thickened. Miller and Baxter stood rooted to the spot. The crowd fell silent. The Pentagon? The security line? Evelyn's voice changed completely. The fatigue and everyday anger were gone, replaced by the sharp, concise, authoritative tone of a military commander. This is Colonel Evelyn Hayes, service number 8-4-9-3-0-2-1-7-5, requesting immediate connection to the office of General Matthews, Priority Alpha. Colonel? Colonel? General Matthews? Alpha Priority? The words were like hammer blows to Miller and Baxter's minds. Miller's face went from red to pale. Cold sweat began to break out on his forehead. Baxter's mouth was open, his eyes wide with horror, staring at the phone as if it were a bomb about to explode. "Stand by, Colonel," the voice on the other end of the line replied immediately, still professional, but with a palpable urgency. Only a few seconds of silence passed. "Colonel Hayes, this is Major Thompson from General Matthews' office. The General is currently unavailable, but I am authorized to handle Priority Alpha calls. Please state the nature of your situation." Evelyn glanced at Miller and Baxter, her eyes piercing. "Major Thompson," she began, her voice even but heavy. "I am currently detained in handcuffs by 2 officers of the Port Authority Police Department at JFK International Airport, Terminal 4 Arrivals Hall, near Baggage Claim Carousel 3. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, enough to hear a sudden intake of breath. "Detained, Colonel?" Major Thompson's voice was tinged with disbelief. "Under what circumstances?" "Circumstances involve apparent racial profiling, verbal abuse, and unprofessional conduct," Evelyn said plainly. "The officers involved are Officer John Miller, badge number 735, and Officer Kevin Baxter, badge number 1124. They have refused to provide a valid reason for the detention and escalated the situation unnecessarily." She paused for a moment, letting the information sink into the minds of all who were listening. "I request immediate intervention from the Department of Defense and coordination with appropriate federal agencies to resolve this situation and investigate the officer's conduct." "Understood, Colonel." Major Thompson's voice was now filled with seriousness. "Your location is confirmed via GPS signal from your device. Intervention protocols are being initiated. Please stand by and maintain the line if possible. Help is on the way." "Affirmative. Hayes out." Evelyn ended the call briefly. Silence fell over the scene. Miller and Baxter stood frozen, their faces drained of color. The smugness and arrogance of earlier had vanished, replaced by utter terror. They had not just picked a fight with a passenger, they had handcuffed a United States Army colonel. They had been singled out in an alpha call to the Pentagon. They could feel their careers, their futures, even their freedoms going up in smoke. Miller trembled and stammered, Colonel, you're the Colonel?" His voice was broken with fear. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She simply stared into his eyes, a cold, unforgiving stare. Her silence was more terrifying than any accusation. Then, as if awakening from a trance, Miller frantically searched his pocket for the handcuff keys. His hands shook so much that he dropped the entire bunch of keys to the floor. The clang of metal against marble echoed loudly in the silence. "Oh my God, Colonel, there must be a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding," Miller stammered as he picked up the keys. We were just doing our job. We didn't know. We really didn't know." He hastily uncuffed Evelyn, almost hurting her more with his confusion. Baxter stood beside her, his face white, not daring to look at anyone, just looking down at the ground. Evelyn rubbed her red wrists, marked with handcuff marks. The marks were more than just marks on her skin. They were evidence of the abuse and prejudice she had just endured. She said nothing to the two trembling officers before her. She just stood there, back straight, eyes fixed on the lobby entrance, waiting. She knew intervention would come soon, and for Miller and Baxter, the nightmare was only just beginning. The crowd stood still, stunned by the sudden change in the situation. Cell phones were still raised, recording the incredible turn of events. They had witnessed a dramatic reversal, from a black woman being bullied by the police to a high-ranking military officer calling the Pentagon. This story would not end there. Less than 10 minutes after Colonel Hayes' dramatic call, 10 minutes that seemed like centuries to Miller and Baxter, the atmosphere in the Terminal 4 arrivals hall began to change dramatically. The arrival of new figures broke the hush of the curious crowd. First came two men in PAPD uniforms of higher rank, a lieutenant and a captain. Their faces were tense and hurried. They had obviously received an urgent radio message, probably accompanied by keywords like Army Colonel, Pentagon, Alpha Priority. The captain, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed mustache, strode toward Evelyn, Miller, and Baxter. His gaze swept over the scene, lingering on the panicked faces of his two subordinates and the cool composure of Evelyn. "What's going on here?" The captain's voice was low and professional, but he couldn't hide his concern. He looked at Miller and Baxter, demanding an explanation. Miller stammered, trying to put his side of the story in his favor, talking about routine checks, uncooperative passengers, but his shaky voice and averted eyes gave it all away. Baxter just stood there, head down. Evelyn Hayes, without waiting for the captain to ask, spoke up. "Captain," she said, her voice clear and distinct. "I am Colonel Evelyn Hayes, United States Army." She pulled her military identification card from her wallet and showed it to him. "I have just returned from an overseas assignment. As I was getting off the plane, I was stopped by two of your officers, Miller and Baxter, without cause. They asked me racially charged questions, insulted me, and then handcuffed me when I asked to know the reason for my detention and to speak to my superiors." The captain took the card, his eyes widening at the sight of the rank and name on it. He swallowed, returning the card to Evelyn with obvious respect. "Colonel Hayes, I am terribly sorry for this incident. This is unacceptable." He turned to glare at Miller and Baxter. "You two, follow me to my office immediately. Hand over your weapons and badges." The trial took place a few months later. The federal courtroom was packed. Colonel Evelyn Hayes, in full ceremonial uniform, sat in the front row with the Justice Department attorney. She had come not to gloat, but to see justice done. Video evidence was shown, witness testimony was repeated. The defense attorneys for Miller and Baxter tried to argue stress of duty and misunderstanding of circumstances, but there was no denying what was on tape and the testimony of the victims themselves. It didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict. Both John Miller and Kevin Baxter were found guilty. The federal judge, after hearing the closing arguments and considering the seriousness of the offenses, the abuse of public trust, the blatant racism, and the impact on the victim, imposed the sentence. "For defendant John Miller," the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, "the court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison." Miller, who had maintained a stoic expression throughout the trial, collapsed. He covered his face, his body shaking. "For defendant Kevin Baxter," the judge continued, "in view of his more passive role and his belated remorse, the court sentences you to 3 years in federal prison." Baxter closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. The sentence was 4 years and 3 years. It was a harsh punishment, reflecting the true nature of the crime. Justice, however belated and painful, had finally been served. Evelyn Hayes watched the two men who had humiliated and handcuffed her being led away, with no joy in her heart, only a heavy sense of the price of fairness and the persistence of evil prejudice in society. A few months after the trial, autumn had turned the trees in Washington, D.C. golden. Colonel Evelyn Hayes stood at the window of her Pentagon office, looking out at the vast courtyard where the leaves were falling. Outside, life continued at the usual bustling pace of the capital. But inside her, the echoes of the events at JFK Airport remained, not as an open wound, but as a scar that reminded her of a harsh reality. She returned to work, to strategy meetings, to confidential reports, to the heavy responsibilities of a senior officer. Colleagues and superiors expressed support and outrage at what had happened to her. The case was dealt with swiftly and decisively, and justice was served with the convictions of Miller and Baxter. In theory, the story had a clear ending. But Evelyn couldn't help but think deeper. She felt a weariness that wasn't just physical. It was mental fatigue, realizing that despite 3 decades of unwavering service, despite her rank as a colonel and her accomplishments, the color of her skin was still the first thing some people saw, a reason enough to doubt, despise, and strip her of her dignity. That fateful day at the airport was a bitter reminder that the fight against prejudice and racism still had a long way to go, even for those who had climbed the social ladder. She wondered if she had not been Colonel Evelyn Hayes that day, but simply Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, an ordinary citizen, a black woman just back from a business trip. Would the incident have been resolved so quickly and thoroughly? Would her call have been given alpha priority? Would the FBI have appeared almost immediately? Would the 2 police officers have faced federal justice and received prison sentences? The answer, she sadly admitted, was probably no. And the thought made her uneasy. Justice had been served for her, but how many others, less privileged than she, had suffered the same treatment in silence, with no one to intervene, no one to listen? Her case, despite its happy ending, had inadvertently exposed a sad truth about the privilege and inequality that still runs deep in the system. Justice should not depend on who you are or who you can call. Human dignity is a fundamental right, not a privilege. The incident also caused ripples. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department faced increased scrutiny and instituted mandatory anti-racism and de-escalation training for its entire force. The case became a case study in discussions about police reform and accountability. At the very least, her harrowing experience contributed to a small change, a small step forward in the larger fight. Evelyn took a deep breath and turned away from the window. On her desk, she found stacks of classified documents waiting to be processed. Her mission was still there. Her country still needed her. The experience had not broken her, but rather strengthened her resolve. Resolve to continue working, to continue striving, to continue being an example of professionalism, courage, and resilience. She would carry that scar with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder of why she had to keep fighting. Not just for herself, but for those who had no voice, who faced injustice every day. The story of the Colonel's appearance at JFK is not just a story about racism and the abuse of power. It is also a story about the strength that lies within each person in the face of adversity, about the importance of standing up for one's dignity, and about the fragile but never-fading hope that justice, however difficult and slow it may sometimes be, can still prevail. Evelyn Hayes's eyes became steadfast. She sat down at her desk and picked up her pen. There was still much work to be done, and she was ready. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.